Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Tom Ruth Speaker Series. Tonight, it's Tuesday night here in Pottstown, and the Tom Ruth Speaker Series was created in honor of longtime beloved instructor of history emeritus, Tom Ruth, who taught at the Hill for 33 years and passed away in February 2016. For those of you who knew Tom, I think he would have loved this series involving alumni and parents and students from all around the world and talking about current events. Tonight, our guest, who, by the way, is not currently on the line, so I'm stalling a little bit, but he was on the line and we lost him, but he'll be back just in time, I'm sure. Our guest tonight is Major General Douglas Odell, class of '67, retired. Major General Douglas Odell, United States Marine Corps, retired, was appointed federal coordinator for the Gulf Coast rebuilding by President George W. Bush. In this role, he also served as a member of the Homeland Security Council. Odell retired from the Marine Corps in 2008 after more than 40 years of total service. He currently consults on matters related to business development in the United States and the Middle East. He's commanded Marines at every level in the infantry, from platoon to division. While in command of 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade for Anti-Terrorism, he oversaw operations to relieve the anthrax threat on Capitol Hill in 2001 and the reestablishment of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan. In 2005, he was Commander, U.S. Marine Forces JTF Katrina Rita during Gulf Coast relief operations, while he was Commanding General of the 4th Marine Division. He is, of course, a graduate of the Hill School, Rutgers University, and the Senior Executive Program at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. This is Doug in his younger days, and his dial picture, his dial picture, known as Digger by his classmates, the great class of 1967, which is responsible for quite a few board members, 2 former board chairs, and the current governor of Pennsylvania. If Doug were on the line, which he still isn't on the line, he would be able to tell us which one of him there is in this picture. Let's see. Everyone look at that picture. See if we can find him. I'm going to go with, hard to say, but maybe he's in there somewhere. It's my birthday tonight, so I'm still stalling here right now. I've got Doug Odell calling me on my phone. Hello there, Doug. You're calling in on my phone, which we've started the show without you. Oh, there you are. We've got you. We've got you. You're here. Hold on. You're back. You're here. Yeah, so come on and join us. All right. So Judy, who is Doug's wife, was able to get him on the line here. So we're gonna go back here. Hi, Judy. We can see you, Judy, and we can hear you. Can you hear me?
Good. Yep, I can hear you. We're good.
All right. Put Doug in, and we'll go from there. All right, everyone. Well, that was interesting. The show must go on.
Come on.
There's Judy. All right. We've got Doug coming in the picture here in just a moment. There he is.
Here I am.
Good to see you, Doug.
Sorry about the technical delay. I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille.
How's the light? Do you need more?
All right.
No,
well, we've got you here. Doug, thanks for joining us. I'm going to make me visible now. Now that you're visible, we want to make sure that everyone can see both of us. I'll get that started in a second. Doug, you missed your introduction, which was quite impressive. We heard all about your time at Hill. We heard about your time in the Marine Corps. And then I shared a picture of me having my birthday cake when I was about 5. So we were really wasting time.
That was during the last pandemic, right?
Yeah. Well, we tried to keep it lively here at the Tom Ruth Speaker Series. Well, welcome, Doug. Doug, tell our listeners where you're calling in from.
Calling in from very rural Sullivan County, Pennsylvania, 14 people per square mile. So social distancing is not an issue here.
Yeah.
This was partly by design because we could have been equally socially distanced at our home in Maine.
Yep.
We've been here about 5 or 6 weeks now, and other than a trip to the post office and occasionally briefly groceries, we're adhering to all of Governor Wolf's admonitions.
So have you been in touch with your classmate, the governor?
I have not, because I make a point of not bothering somebody when they're terribly busy.
Well, I'm sure he
As
appreciates
much as I
that.
admire him.
He might appreciate just a attaboy at some point here, I'm sure.
You can count on it.
So Doug, what's the name of the town? You're in Sullivan County. What's the name of the town you're in?
LaPorte, established in 1842, although this area has been settled since the 18th century by colonials, and it was a very populated Native American population before that.
And is this were you living there when you first started at the Hill?
No, I'm born and raised in Pottstown, just 5 or 6 blocks from the Hill School. I'm a townie and proud of it, and walked to school uphill both ways to and from the school in my 5 years there, although my 6th form year I boarded, which was a tremendous experience.
You are now the 3rd 5-year boy to come on the show. We had Norm Pearlstein, who was one of our 5-year boys.
Mm-hmm.
And we had Mike Vaughn just the other day was on the show. And so our listeners now know what second form is, even though most of them don't know what it is today. It doesn't
Well,
exist.
we 5-year boys have an extra year to get it right.
For sure. Now, in your day, there weren't many day students, as I recall.
I think the average day student population was maybe 20 or less.
Out of 500.
We were confined to a fairly tiny space for our common room in the basement of the former middle school.
Donner Hall.
Yeah, Donner Hall, under Donner Hall.
Well, it will please you to know that this year we had about 120 day students.
I know that because I follow that trend closely.
Well,
I'm an advocate for local young men and women coming to the Hill.
so how many Odells or Odell relatives attended the Hill School or have attended the Hill School?
My brother, who was class of 68, a year behind me, and the Sutton brothers, who graduated in the late 90s and 2000.
The Dunns are related, right?
And the Dunns, yes. Stephanie, their mother, is my first cousin. And
Well, I see that
they've done
Aiden Dunn is on the call tonight, so hopefully
Well,
he'll
good.
be giving up a question for you
I saw
later.
Aiden on the Hill School's Facebook page the other day.
Well, we have a couple of Dunn families. We've got that Dunn family. We've got another Dunn family, and one of them is on the call tonight. So there's going to be all sorts of confusion tonight, but we'll try to get it straight. Okay, so you came to Hill 5 years. What was the most important, or one or two of the most important aspects of your Hill School experience and that prepared you for a life, the life that you've led, especially in the military?
Aside from beating Lawrenceville twice in my 5th and 6th form year in football.
Besides that, yeah.
I've been thinking about this because there were so many wonderful moments at the Hill School, especially when I boarded. The guys that I lived with on 3 US remain extremely close friends today. We're in regular contact with one another. But I'm going to share something that I have not told a whole lot of people before. And that is that in my 6th form year, I was starting tailback on the football team. And trying to come from behind the first game of the year. I injured my knee in the third quarter of the game. And I was able to come back and play the remainder of the season, except for re-injuring that knee in the Lawrenceville game on Dell Field. That knee injury galvanized me for the rest of my life in terms of overcoming obstacles.
Well, it's interesting. I just gave a chapel talk about a knee injury of mine that had a similar impact on
I
my
saw
life.
that.
Yeah.
I saw
But
that
Doug,
chapel talk.
Before you came on the line, we were trying to figure out in this picture which one is you. Can you see the picture on your screen there?
Yes, it's me, left front row, all the way left front row.
All the way left.
Yes.
Front row. Down there on the end?
Down there on the end, sitting next to Chip Pancoast, and directly behind me is my very good friend to this day, Bill Keys, who is our manager.
Sure. The florist.
Yes.
Well, while we were talking, a note came in from Kent Davis, who I'm sure that name is familiar to you.
Yes, I do. I know
He
Ken.
said, Doug and my father worked together in the early 1970s. Doug is a big reason why I ended up at the Hill School. Doug's mother was a tougher character than he was. Kent Davis, class of 79, parent 14 and 16.
Yeah, my mother was strong-willed, we'll put it that way.
All right, so you go to the Hill School, you have a good experience, much influenced by close friends, a great class, athletics, I'm sure, strong academics. Where did you head from Hill?
I ended up going to Rutgers.
Okay.
For a couple of different reasons. I was accepted, interestingly enough, I think primarily because of my Hill School credentials at everywhere I applied. I went to Rutgers because I had an opportunity to continue playing football and ultimately ice hockey and rugby at Rutgers.
Wow.
So
that knee held up.
The knee held up.
And at what point did you know that you wanted to enter the military?
Well, the realities in the fall of 1967 are different than they are today in some respects. We were, of course, in the midst of the Vietnam War. The draft was a real and present aspect of anyone's life in those days. And I had long decided, even before I started in college, that I wanted to be the master of my own fate, but still serve my country. And I originally envisioned being a naval officer. And then I was literally ambushed by a Marine Corps recruiting officer in the student union at Rutgers in October of 1967. He persuaded me that the Marine Corps was a better choice for various and sundry reasons, not all of which would stand the test of time today.
Well, my father-in-law used to tell a similar story, except he went to go sign up for the Navy, and they were on a lunch break, so he went next door to the Marine Corps. And that,
Well,
no, sorry, he went to sign up for the Army, which his father had been in the Army, and the Marine Corps office was open instead. So that's where he ended up.
But I ended up in the Marine Corps in what's called the Platoon Leaders Class program, where I could, unlike the ROTC, there was no participation during the academic year, but there were 6-week training increments in the summer at Quantico, Virginia. And I was ultimately commissioned a second lieutenant in the Marines in July of '71 after I graduated from Rutgers.
So is that a program that still exists today as an
Oh, yeah.
alternative to ROTC?
It's unique to the Marine Corps. It dates from the late 1930s.
So it allows you to focus on your academic program during the year and spend your summers with the Marine Corps. And I assume they pay for your college years too, or most of it.
No, they don't. There's a stipend in the last 2 years for basic subsistence. but there's no academic awards and so forth. But the distinct advantage is my enlistment date in the Marine Corps is March 28th, 1968, which begins the clock for my time and service pay calculations.
Ah, interesting.
So when I was a second lieutenant at Quantico, completing my training, I was making a couple $100 more a month because of time and service than Naval Academy graduates whose clock didn't start ticking until the day they graduated from Annapolis.
Can you explain? It's something I've sort of I mean, I think I sort of know the answer, but why has the Marine Corps never created its own service academy?
Because they are part of the naval service.
I get that, but
And
has there ever been a thought to create their own branch and sort of create their own academy?
I'm sure there was some hallucination during an evening at an officers club somewhere to that line, but I think the Marine Corps' roots to the Naval Academy run pretty deep.
What percentage of Naval Academy graduates go on to be in the Marine Corps as opposed to the Navy?
It is set by law. 16% of Naval Academy graduates matriculate to the Marine Corps.
Do you have a choice?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So they sort of have to fill that quota each year.
Yeah, and it's based on your academic standard and other metrics.
So before we get to your work in the Gulf Coast, which I think is fairly relevant to the time we're in today,
Yes.
one of the things that came up in your introduction was your involvement with anthrax. Can you talk about that and maybe how that relates to a little bit of what we're dealing with now?
Yes, that was an unexpected experience. You may recall that barely months after 9/11, there was an anthrax contamination of this Senate Hart office building.
Yeah.
Under my command, as part of 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade Anti-Terrorism, which I assumed about a week after 9/11, that was command of all the Marine Corps' global anti-terrorism forces, was a unit called the Chemical Biological Incident Response Force, based in Indian Head, Maryland, which is down the Potomac River from Washington. And that was a unique organization within the entire military, specifically designed to respond to chemical and biological incidents created by then Commandant Chuck Krulak, General Chuck Krulak, years before 9/11. And they were particularly well positioned to respond to that event. The contractors, the civilian contractors that were also queried about their ability to clean up the Senate Hart office building, said it would take 6 weeks to get the job done. My Marines got it done in 72 hours.
What correlation can you draw from that to, the situation we're in today, in terms of the military's involvement in these kinds of biological threats?
Well, of course, there are other units that, well, I should say first off, all service members are trained in personal protection against biological threats, but those are particular and chemical threats, but those are particularly directed threats. Chemical gases on the battlefield and the like. But something like what we're experiencing now is an entirely different kettle of fish.
Mm-hmm.
Service members, Marines in particular, but I would extend that to everyone in uniform, are by their nature compliant to the rules and regulations that govern good order and discipline in the service, including protecting yourself and one another against various threats, in this case, a virus. The population at large, unfortunately, is not as compliant. And that's been part of our problem, has been well documented by Dr. Fauci and others.
Yeah. Before I want to get to Katrina shortly. Just a little bit more on your career. What would you say was the most difficult assignment that you had, or command that you had, and then what was your favorite? And maybe they're the same, but maybe they're different.
No, they're different. Let me take your second question first.
Okay.
The best job that I had as a Marine officer, although I loved leading troops as a junior lieutenant and captain, and being with troops generally, is commanding the 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade Anti-Terrorism for 3 years immediately following 9/11. I had a global engagement. I had Marines in every time zone around the globe. And those were very challenging, but intellectually engaging, morally engaging days. The worst job that I had in terms of personal experience, following my assignment at 4th Marine Brigade, was Commanding General of 4th Marine Division. Unlike my experience at 4th Brigade, though we had some deaths from non-war related incidents, I, from day one, had 3+ battalions of Marines in Iraq, in the Western Desert. And over the course of the 2.5 years I commanded the division, we sustained 112 KIA and many more wounded. I attended many of the funerals of those KIAs in hometowns all over America. Taking care of Marines is, or should be, uppermost in the minds of Marine officers at any level. And that struck me particularly hard. It was a very difficult period.
Now, when you ended your active service, were you in the reserves for a number of years, or did you retire as an active, in an active role?
Well, like many reserve officers, generals and otherwise, I had a bifurcated career path. When I worked with Kent Davis's father in the late 70s in Reading, I was a reserve officer, having served 3.5 years on active duty prior to that, out on the West Coast. And I was drilling in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, with an infantry company there. And I continued largely along that path until Desert Storm came along, and I was on active duty for 9 months during Desert Storm. I did not go to Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. I ended up in Central America involved in counter-narcotics operations, because yo puedo hablar español fluentemente.
Was that a skill you learned at Hill?
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Who was your Spanish teacher?
Oh, oh God. I wish I had prepared for this meeting better.
That wasn't a question on the preparation.
It'll come to me. Okay. And then after Desert Storm, the 90s were very interesting for a number of reasons, including in 1997, I was as a colonel, the Deputy Joint Operations Officer of the Standing Joint Task Force. And I was the exercise director for an exercise that took place in Stuttgart, Germany, the core scenario of which was a pandemic. Mm. And I got my eyes opened in a major way from that experience. And I must say that everything I learned from that exercise in 1997 in terms of how things might play out socially in a threatened population in terms of fear, panic, failure to follow guidelines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is I could have written the scenario or the script for the way things have played out in the United States over the last 90, 120 days.
Yeah. Last question before we get to Katrina, which is, we have a number of students listening tonight, young alumni. What would you say to them if they're considering a career in the military, a career of service? Is that something that you would recommend, or what are the critical questions they should be asking themselves as they consider that path?
Let me answer that question in this form. Judy and I have 5 sons, all of whom from an early age grew up in a military or reserve military household. Right. They saw my comings and goings as part of my military service in conjunction with my civilian career simultaneously. We never expected as a mandate that any of our sons serve in the military, let alone all of our sons. One ultimately did, graduating from Cornell and into nuclear submarines in the Navy. But the other 4 all did their part in terms of service to others. Our oldest son taught for 2 years at the Red Cloud Indian Mission in Pine Ridge, South Dakota for the princely sum of $150 a month plus room and board. Our middle son, Andy, did Habitat for Humanity in the Dominican Republic. Our 4th son, Paul, worked with the hearing impaired, and he is, for the last 20 years, been a sound engineer at NFL Films. And our youngest son, Tom, who went to George Washington in Washington, D.C., worked in a soup kitchen when he was in college, and he's now a very successful chef. They all served, they all contributed, but they did it in their own way, but they met our mandate.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's turn our attention to Katrina and Clean Up. How did that, give me some dates here, remind our listeners of what was going on at that time in the world and in our country, and how you got involved.
Well, there's really 2 parts to that story, and I'll take the first of those parts. I had been originally stationed in New Orleans in 1998, prior to being promoted to Brigadier General. I was the Deputy Chief of Staff at Marine Force Headquarters in New Orleans. And I did that for almost exactly 3 years. And then I was reassigned to, after I was promoted to Brigadier General, to a job as the Vice Commander of Marine Forces, Europe, Atlantic, and South America in Norfolk, which was my job at the time of 9/11. On 9/11, I was in Houston, Texas, having just celebrated my retirement as a partner at the investment firm that I had been long associated with. That was the evening of the 10th of September, 2001. And the morning of 9/11, I woke up to an emergency phone call, and by noon that day, I was on active duty. I spent that night in New Orleans, went back to Norfolk. The morning after I arrived in Norfolk, I was told I was going to command the Marine Corps Global Anti-Terrorism Forces. And that started me on a very interesting path to include commanding 4th Marine Division. I told you about the experience that I had with casualties in the division, and I went out to Iraq in August of 2005 because one of my battalions had just gone through a very tough patch, sustaining 22 KIAs in 3 days in late July and August. And I wanted to be with them, and it was to assess their mental and physical state. And I got back from Iraq on the 26th of August of 2005. Went on leave to our home in Maine. I was not there 24 hours that I got a call from my 3-star boss in New Orleans that they were evacuating the headquarters in the face of Katrina, and that I should be prepared to bring forces back to reconstitute the headquarters in New Orleans. I spent that weekend building that composite force from units outside the affected area in Dallas, Jackson, Mississippi, Cincinnati, Ohio, Florida, Norfolk, Virginia, concentrating on mobility, especially capability that was amphibious, communications and transportation land-wise as well.
So you were were you just given carte blanche to sort of create and constitute a team?
Yes, but I didn't have the authority to deploy them until Sunday afternoon. I got that verbal authority Sunday afternoon, and my Marines started moving to assembly areas in Jackson, Mississippi on the Sunday before the hurricane hit on Monday. So my first Marines into the affected area in Mississippi and Louisiana were there on Tuesday morning.
Is that a little unusual to mobilize the Marine Corps as opposed to mobilizing the National Guard?
Well, a good question. Initially, it was done specifically for Marine Corps purposes, and that is to safeguard and reestablish our headquarters in New Orleans. But that very quickly, in the ensuing 72 hours following the storm, morphed into a joint task force, of which I was the Marine Forces component commander. I was shortly thereafter joined by a brigade of the 82nd Airborne, the Truman Battle Group from the Navy, an amphibious ready group from Norfolk and Camp Lejeune, and then various Air Force elements. The National Guard obviously came into play, but there are some very distinct differences between the authorities that the National Guard and federal troops, including Federal Reserve troops, can carry out, governed by the Posse Comitatus Act that prohibit federal troops, absent martial law, from enforcing the peace.
Was martial law ever enacted? Was it
No.
ever important? It was never.
It was avidly discussed. The Secretary of Defense was viscerally opposed. There were other elements within the Department of Defense that advocated it, but I think the right decision was ultimately made is that auxiliary law enforcement or augmentation of law enforcement by National Guard units, not only from Mississippi and Louisiana, but from all over the United States, take on that role, because Title 32 troops can be deputized as law enforcement officers. When I say Title 32, they are National Guard troops as opposed to Title 10 federal troops.
So I didn't realize, Doug, that you were on the ground or had sort of been activated before before the hurricane hit?
Um, Activated is probably motivated might be a better word.
Yeah.
The better descriptor. Um, Having ultimately lived in New Orleans for 6 years, I knew the vulnerabilities of the city well at numerous levels, including the population. And I knew that the likelihood of an urgent response and against a backdrop of a very traumatic outcome would be necessary.
So I just want to tie two things together here. I want to go back to your comments about losing Marines and the impact that that had on you personally as their commander, but as a fellow Marine and as a father, and connect that to what you know you're going into in the Gulf Coast, knowing what's going to happen here and that many lives are going to be lost, many outside of your control, not in battle, but certainly in a battle for their lives. How talk to me about how that feels as a human being when you're responsible for those people, and I can't even imagine how hard that is.
Well, let me first give you a descriptor. One of the units that was assigned to me from Camp Lejeune, they arrived by ship, was 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, who only 7 or 8 months earlier had been in the Battle of Fallujah in Iraq, a pretty bitter fight.
Yes.
And they said their responsibilities during Hurricane Katrina were tougher than the Battle of Fallujah. That sort of sets the stage for the frame of mind that we were all in.
So when do you actually put boots on the ground in New Orleans or nearby New Orleans?
I arrived in Mississippi on Thursday night after the storm. It took some finagling to get me there because normal air service into anywhere in that region was completely interrupted. I ended up coming in through Atlanta, where I stopped in the headquarters of U.S. First Army because my ultimate boss during Katrina was Lieutenant General Russ Honore, who was commander of First Army. He was already on the ground, but I wanted to visit with his chief of staff and his operations officer before I got into the theater, because communications in the first week or 10 days, as we discovered in the theater, was very difficult. So better to have face-to-face encounters if possible, unlike today.
How big was the theater, or how big did it start and how big did it get? What was your what was the boundaries of this disaster for you?
Well, that's a good question. The impacted area, the focal point, which is where Katrina came ashore with a 26-foot tidal surge, was literally on the
Doug, we lost you here. Are you still there?
Bay St. Louis. Here.
You're back.
Okay, great. I landed at Stennis Air Force Base, Stennis Field at the NASA Center, about midway between the Louisiana border and Gulfport, Mississippi, which was the only practicable operating airfield at that time on a military flight. We initially went to Gulfport, Mississippi, where I had one of my units, an amphibian unit, who were already seriously engaged. That was on Thursday night, the 22nd of September, I think it was. That's where I first met Lieutenant General Honore. Because of the deteriorating situation in Louisiana, particularly in metropolitan New Orleans, he directed me to reorient my Marines, which were about 2,800 or 2,900 Marines, into the eastern and southern suburbs of New Orleans, which we did very promptly. So my headquarters ended up being in St. Bernard Parish, which is immediately east and south of Orleans Parish, in Chalmette, which is the site of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And we had some naval shipping there, and I established my headquarters on the USS Shreveport, along with my headquarters group, which at the time was pretty modest. We bulked that up, bringing some other support in from Kansas City, Kansas, over the succeeding week. It was a very fluid situation in the first 10 days. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of speculation, very much like what's going on today. I'll share a vignette with you. General Honore's headquarters was on the USS Iwo Jima at the foot of Canal Street on the Mississippi River. And we would twice a day meet there in the ready room for meetings with Mayor Nagin and Governor Blanco, Lieutenant Governor Landeroux, other emergency management officials from the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans, and my fellow commanders, to keep ourselves completely updated. And I happened to be seated next to Mitch Landeroux, who was the lieutenant governor of Louisiana at the time. And he turned to me and said, you have the toughest job of anybody in this room, because we think there's 5,000 people dead in St. Bernard Parish. And St. Bernard Parish, most of St. Bernard Parish and the lower Ninth Ward, which is immediately adjacent to St. Bernard, was under 14 feet of water. So we had no idea what the casualties were. Fortunately, his predictions were way wrong in the right way. Yes, there was life lost, but nowhere near the 5,000.
Yeah. So Doug, how long were you there? How long was your team in place there? And did it expand outside of Louisiana to include, the other Gulf states?
Yes. Mississippi was uniquely organized to respond to this for reasons that I won't bore you with, other than the fact that their National Guard was very well prepared, and their governor, Haley Barbour, really had a game plan in his hip pocket. Unfortunately, Louisiana was somewhat the polar opposite, compounded by communications difficulties, infrastructure difficulties, and the like. We were there in New Orleans for about 4 weeks. And you may recall that on the heels of Katrina, virtually literally, about 3.5 weeks in, the Gulf was further threatened by Hurricane Rita.
Right.
And our troops were living in the open, in tents and other shelter, but potentially exposed, And we had also naval ships that were in confined spaces. And we elected to evacuate some of our troops by land, but we embarked on 3 different naval vessels, including the Shreveport and the Iwo Jima and the Tulare, the amphibious ready group that had come from Norfolk. And we sortied out into the Gulf of Mexico and rode out.
That's when it pays to have your friends from the Naval Academy ready.
Well, most of the sailors in the amphibious Navy are not Naval Academy graduates.
No, I'm just kidding. But this is where the Marine and the Navy connection came into play.
Yes.
Doug, let me, obviously this is a very different kind of disaster.
Yes.
That you dealt with there. A natural disaster confined to one region. Today we're dealing with a natural disaster of a different kind that is not confined to one region, that is spreading throughout the globe. I don't think any, other than Antarctica, any continent has been spared. But I want to talk about one thing that's very much in the news today that I think you can help us with a little bit or share your perspective on, is this notion of interstate cooperation or lack thereof, as well as federal interaction or collaboration or lack thereof. And this has been all the news the last 48 hours about several states, coming together to form coalitions on the East Coast, on the West Coast, to try to reopen the economy, to collaborate on medical supplies, on purchasing, and the push and pull and the tension between the federal government and the states. You mentioned sitting in a room with governors and mayors and military officials. How did that play out, and how do you see the analogy to today's situation? Doug, you froze there. It's a long question. Oh, there you are. You're back.
I'm sorry.
You're back.
Am I back?
Yeah,
Okay.
did you hear my question?
Yes, I did. It just happens that I've been reading a book about the challenges of flood control in the United States.
We lost you again. Just when you were going to tell us the
Getting to
answers.
the federalist form of government. Am I back?
You're back now.
I was reading about our federalist form of government relative to flood control starting in the 19th century and how that impeded solutions because states with levee districts and dikes and dams and so forth and so on had their own ideas. That's somewhat analogous to what we're dealing with today. I applaud the idea that adjacent states are forming compacts to sort out the vagaries of their geographic situation. I have a son who lives with his family in Seattle, Washington. The situation there is markedly different than it is in, say, Maine, and to some degree in Pennsylvania. Yeah. And I think birds of a feather should flock together in forming solutions, especially in an area that is as densely populated as the mid-Atlantic states between Philadelphia and New York and northern New Jersey and Baltimore and
borders don't matter too much when it comes to a virus.
No.
Same with a flood and a hurricane, right?
Yes, that's pretty much it.
But one of the things you mentioned, Doug, that I think is relevant, you talked about the difference between the preparedness of Louisiana versus the preparedness of Mississippi. Yep. And one of the things that I read in the last day or so was the comparison between Kentucky and Tennessee and how they're dealing with COVID-19. And one state has closed schools, stay at home, did all of those things much earlier, I think it was a week earlier. And all you have to do is look at the chart and the flattened curve in one state and the surge in the next.
Well, that is part of what the challenge with our federalist system.
Yeah.
We have 50 different, let alone territorial opinions as to how it should play out at the local level. And early on in this event, I was of the opinion that certain decisions should be left to local leadership, let's say at the county commissioner level. I've since rethought that and think that a regional response, multi-state regional response, is a better solution.
So I'm going to open up the floor here to some questions from our audience. And while I'm explaining to them how to do that, most of them know how, I'll ask one more question just to give them some time to populate our question board here. There's two ways to do this for our audience. You can raise your hand, and I see someone's raised their hand, which is great, and we'll get to that question in just a second. Or you can type in a question in the Q&A, and we'll get to it. So my last question, Doug, is what do you see as the role of the military today with COVID-19? We've obviously seen the Army Corps of Engineers out and about building, temporary hospitals and, that kind of thing. But do you think that, the military is the right arm of the federal government to be involved, or is it more FEMA? Is it more the CDC? I mean, what will it be?
I think selectively, and I'll cite a significant difference in terms of the federal military's role and the National Guard, for that matter, between Katrina and this event. The responsibilities of most of my Marines during Katrina were doing house-to-house searches in the heavily inundated, damaged areas, hoping to find survivors and so on. But they were, by and large, infantrymen, truck drivers, communicators, and the like. What is more needed, as we've seen, is the capabilities of the Army Corps of Engineers and related outfits, to include medical people. The medical resources of the military are finite, just like anybody else. And they also have their soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen to take care of at home station. So it's not a silver bullet in that regard. I think the Corps of Engineers has done eye-watering good service in the speed at which they've gotten these hospitals established in New York and elsewhere, and of course the Comfort and the Mercy in New York and Los Angeles.
Have you ever been on those ships?
I've been on Comfort. I've been on. They're fabulous vessels.
Yeah.
Everything they're advertised to be and more.
Doug, are you ready for your first question?
Yes, I am. I think.
Right. So the first question is a little tongue-in-cheek. It's from your friend Kent Davis, who wants to know if you could ask your friend the governor to please reopen liquor stores in Pennsylvania. No need to answer that one.
Kent, you must be channeling me. We have one liquor store here in Sullivan County. It's about the size of a two-car garage. And the day the announcement was made, I went over there to replenish vital fluids. And
we have students listening, Doug, just so you know.
Yes, and there were 15 people in line. And I was one of the first 10 people into the store, accomplished my task in 10 minutes or less. By the time I left the liquor store, there were 35 people in line. I have agreed with my classmate and dear friend Tom Wolf, throughout his term. But when I first got wind of this, which happened to be a couple of days before the announcement was official, I knew, interestingly enough, from my experience at Katrina, that this would immediately create a black market. People from out of area bringing supplies in, or people from the area going to get supplies, only to transmit the disease. I'm afraid I didn't agree with him.
Yeah.
And I agree with Kent Davis.
All right, we have our first speaker on the phone. This is
Hello.
Kendall Thomas. Kendall, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes. Hi, Kendall. Welcome to the show.
So I do have a question. How do you think the shock of Hurricane Katrina compares to this natural disaster, that being the coronavirus?
On a couple of levels. Obviously, the shock to the residents of the affected area, Mississippi and Louisiana specifically, and as an epicenter, Orleans Parish and St. Bernard Parish and Jefferson Parish, that defines Metro New Orleans. The shock was significant, and it took them years to recover from it. I think the shock and fear here is more predicated by uncertainty as to when this will end, or when this will be mitigated by the arrival of a vaccine. I have to be frank, I think speculation on how long this will last only heightens anxiety. I think the proper answer is we're doing our best, and as soon as we can, but not too soon, that it will put you at risk. Does that answer your question, Kendall?
Yes, thank you so much.
You're
So
welcome.
you would say that this is more like, because of the uncertainty is different, as in the shock from Katrina was more like, how do we recover from this, but we don't know when this will end. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean,
Perfect. Thank you.
It's sort of like having a sports injury.
Mm-hmm.
Some sports injuries you get over pretty quickly. Others, you're in rehab. We're in rehab at the moment.
I see what you're saying. Thank you.
Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Kendall. Thanks, Kendall. Good to hear you. Doug, interestingly, New Orleans is one of the epicenters right now.
Yes.
And there's, what do you attribute that to, and how does it relate to your experience there during the Gulf cleanup?
Well, first and foremost, the culture in New Orleans, and I learned this from living there, is unlike any other city in North America in terms of social distancing. People like to be close. They live close. It's a fairly compact city. They like to be out and about with their friends, not necessarily on Bourbon Street, but in churches and other celebrations. Mardi Gras, unfortunately, happened at a very unfortunate time of the year that only exacerbated the threat. I have a number of very good friends, both former Marine colleagues as well as civilians living in New Orleans. I'm in touch with them regularly. Fortunately, they've not been affected, but it's just the nature of New Orleans. And you could arguably say the same about Queens, New York.
Yeah. All right. We have a question from your good friend here on the faculty, Mr. Dolhoff.
Hey, John.
He writes, as a retired military leader, I'm wondering General Odell's opinion on the situation on the USS Theodore Roosevelt and the removal of Captain Crozier from leadership.
John,
That's a little bit of a curveball there.
I can catch curves as well as fastballs. Um, I've, with former military colleagues, discussed this situation. If I had been the Secretary of the Navy, the acting Secretary of the Navy, or Commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet, I think I would have handled it differently for a lot of different reasons. Captain Crozier acted as any commander concerned with the welfare of his crew or troops. Did cross a line, but I think it's an excusable crossing of the line under the circumstances. And I would have had him visit me, and I might have ripped his lips off, but I would not have relieved him of his command.
How different do you think it is in this day and age, Doug? I watched social media postings of his crew chanting Captain Crozier. For the most part, while you were serving, there was no such thing as Twitter or YouTube or social media or cell phones with cameras, and maybe towards the end of your career. How hard is it right now with the transparency and the 24-hour news cycle to be a commanding officer in those circumstances, or to be in the military at all?
Well, all of the services, when officers rise to the level of general or flag rank, receive training in a number of protocols, not the least of which is communicating with the press. And there are do's and don'ts, at a minimum, yellow flags, that you listen carefully to the question, and you don't inadvertently or purposely cross the line.
Yeah.
Because there's a number of things that you could say that could have second and third level of consequence that you could not possibly anticipate.
Yeah. All right. Well, you got through that question pretty unscathed. Good job, Doug. You there? We lost you for a second, but I'm pretty sure you're going to come back. While we're waiting for you to come back, I'm going to have one of our students, Aiden Dunn, who's a relative of yours, has raised his hand. Aiden, are you there?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Aiden.
How are you?
I'm good. The question is, can General Odell hear you? He seems to have frozen here. Oh,
you're back.
There he is. Perfect timing. I stalled long enough. So, Doug, we have Aiden Dunn on the call.
Oh, do we lose him again?
We did, but why don't you ask your question, and by the time you're done asking your question, maybe he'll be back.
Sounds good. So Mr. Odell talked a lot about his professional career, and he also talked about how he was a multi-sport athlete, both at Hill and at Rutgers. So I was wondering what his favorite aspect of academics were at Hill. Is there one moment that you remember in the classroom, or a favorite teacher that you still have a strong relationship to this day? So,
Doug, did you hear the question? Are you still there? Doug? It's a tough one, Aiden. He's speechless.
Yeah, I don't.
Oh, wait, no, he's back. Doug, can you hear us?
Unequivocally, Chuck Watson.
Former headmaster and English teacher. You got like a partial answer there, Aiden. I've never seen Doug Odell speechless before. This is quite a moment. Well, we're learning the ins and outs here of Zoom technology and rural Pennsylvania. Doug, you're back. Sort of.
Can you hear?
No.
We sort of lost you there. Aiden, how are you doing, Aiden?
I'm doing well. I'm home. I'm only about 15 minutes from Hill, so I'm doing well. The family's all here and they're all healthy. So,
How many of you are under one roof?
we have 5 of us. So,
Oh my goodness. All right. What are your home chores right now, Aiden?
I had a vacuum earlier today, keeping the house clean.
I can hear your mother chuckling. It doesn't sound like you did a very good job.
Yeah, she's keeping me busy. So,
All right. Well, I did hear,
Do you want to turn off the screen? Do I want to turn off the screen?
Doug, we can hear you. I'm going to try to stop his video, but that didn't seem to work. All right, Aiden. Doug, we can hear you, but we can't see you anymore. Can you?
If you can hear me.
Yep, we can sort of hear you. Doug, are you there? Aiden,
Oh,
he's in and out there.
yeah.
We'll give it a second here.
Sounds good.
Awkward silence.
I'm here.
Okay. Doug, the question was, what was a memorable experience in the classroom and a teacher that prepared you for your career?
Mr. Lehman.
Yeah. You want to ask me a question, Aiden?
No, I actually have a fun fact to pass some time here. Patrick Gunn, my brother, class of 2018, or 2019, he graduated last year. It's his birthday today as well.
Hey.
Happy birthday, Patrick.
So you share a birthday with him.
Doug Odell just came back on the line to wish him happy birthday.
Yep, we're fading in and out here, but
You're good. You're good now. Tell while you're back, Doug. Tell us about your favorite Hill experience and how it prepared you.
Academically, it was hands down Chuck Watson. Contemporary history, the Franco-Prussian War to the end of World War II. He really introduced me to the idea of critical thinking, which was a game changer for me, that I've carried with me the rest of my life. On the football field, and it was Dick O'Shaughnessy, who was a tremendous coach. For
our listeners there, that is Mrs. Nelson's father.
Yeah, I've known Mrs. Nelson since she was about 2.
Well, thank you for your question, Aiden. Happy birthday to Patrick, and any other April 14th birthdays out there. Thanks for calling in.
Thank you. Stay healthy.
You too.
Take care, Aiden. Say hello to your mother and father for me.
All right, I have another question on the line from Kirsten Lang. I'm going to allow Kirsten to talk. Kiki Lang. Kiki, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Hi, Kiki. Welcome to the show. Hope you're doing well.
Hi. So my question is, you went to Hill at a really interesting time during like the civil rights movement, and in my history class, I did a little bit of research about Hill during that time, and I was just curious on what your like experience at Hill during that time period was, just because there's not a lot on it in the archives at all.
Interesting question that I've reflected on many times over the years. Prior to coming to the Hill, I was in a parochial school in Pottstown. There were 90 kids in my first grade class, and that pretty much continued until I left there to come to the Hill. But there were no minority students whatsoever. In my second form year, I think there was 23 in my second form class. Bob Wesley, who's now a retired cardiologist living in Las Vegas, was the first black fellow or first African-American that I ever went to school with. And Bob and I became and remain very good friends. But you have to understand that the Hill School of the 1960s and up into the 70s, maybe even beyond that, was a bit of a cocoon. We were somewhat quarantined, to use a popular word, from what was going on down the hill and around the corner. I vividly remember I was standing in the Widener Arts and Crafts building during the 1 o'clock period in a shop course conducted by Carl Pakinowski, who was the woodshop instructor, and Phil Milecrane, who was a Hill graduate and the metal shop instructor, came running up the stairs from the basement level and ran into the shop looking for Mr. Pakinowski and was shouting at the top of his lungs, "Kennedy has been shot." I was at the bandsaw cutting a piece of wood at the time. That memory, I can walk right to the spot where I was standing when that happened. It was incidents like that that certainly impacted us at the Hill, but the day in, day out sturm and drang of political events off of the Hills campus, we were somewhat inoculated from, or isolated from, I guess I'd say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Kiki, thanks for
welcome.
calling in. Good to hear your voice.
You too.
All right, we're going to take a risk here. We have a caller who I don't know who it is, Dan P. We're going to allow Dan to talk. Hold on a second. This is always the interesting part of our show. Dan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's Dan Pettigrew.
Okay.
A fellow 5-year day boy, 2 years ahead of Doug.
Danny, how are you?
All right, sir. And a little levity I wanted to add that I recently was informed that you were my sister Nancy's first kiss. And
Nolo contender.
Cover your ears. Jude.
she didn't know if you'd remember that or not, but she wanted to say hello. So
Well, say hello to her as well.
Dan, do you have a question, or were you just calling
no,
to?
I just thought I'd add that little. I thought I'd just add that little anecdote that you know.
Hey, Dan, before
Yes,
you
sir.
get off, last week I had a very pleasant and somewhat lengthy conversation with Dolph Prince.
He's tuned in. He's tuned in.
Oh, good. He's living in Reno, Nevada.
That's correct. So I don't know if he's going to join anything on the airwaves, but he did tell me he had a very nice conversation with you last week. So
He's on right now. Should we let him talk?
you can try. I'll see if he wants to. But thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to see you, Doug.
Great to see you, Dan.
Dolph, I'm letting you talk. Are you there? Can you hear us?
I am here.
Yeah, there you go. This is like a modern miracle.
Hey, Doug.
Dolphy,
how you
how
doing,
are
man?
you? I'm good.
This is
Yeah,
Playing Chinese ping pong.
we had a great talk, and we recollected the summer when Doug and his brother Tim and I redecorated the day boy room. And Doug, do you wanna tell the audience what happened when Mr. Lambert, with great concern, came in?
I feel like I'm being punked here. What's going on?
Well, the day boy room was a fetid room in the basement of the old middle school, under what are today the steps up into the academic building coming across the quad. It had formerly been a locker room for the swimming pool that was under middle school back in the day.
Yeah.
And Dolph and my brother and I undertook to clean up the day boy room during our time.
Doug, you're breaking up again. Dolph, do you want to finish the story for him?
Yeah, we we did all kinds of things. We painted the lockers. We found an abandoned, what we thought was a ship's wheel, a big wheel, like a ship's wheel. And we carted that back to the day boy room and refinished it.
Okay.
And that was part of the decoration. So I wasn't there when this happened with Mr. Lambert, but Doug was. And Mr. Lambert, who was the treasurer then of the Hill. Was that right, Doug?
Yes.
And why don't you finish it, Doug?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Good. Mr.
Oh, damn.
We lost him. All right. Well, Dolph, thanks for
I'll
playing
quickly,
Lambert, 50 Ds.
Mr. Lambert came in and then he looked around. He said, oh, okay, this is good. And walked out. So we got away with it. So
All right, that was a much better ending than I was expecting. It was a pretty PG ending. Dolph, thanks for calling in. I'm gonna go to the next question. Thanks for chatting.
Okay. Yep.
Take care. All right, we have one more question, and then we're going to wrap up the night. I've got Bob Wyman on the line. Bob, can you hold on? Go ahead, Bob. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Bob, you have a question for the general.
Yeah, I do. And I think an important one, especially since having been in the Marine Corps, you spent your life in a leadership position. And so I'm almost sorry this is the last question because it's not that, well, anyway. The late 60s were a rough time for the school. I think it was the year after you left, 68, when I think a very high proportion of the class of the school actually got bumped out for drugs and various other offenses. At the time of the late 60s, people wouldn't have had a great hope, I think, for the Hill students who were there because of all the upheavals and things that were going on. Yet, as Zach Lehman pointed out, the members of your class, and I know subsequent classes, have had sort of a great history of leadership and of contributing to society since. Essentially, making us see that they were very different people than one might have assumed at the time. And I wonder, given that you've seen men grow and develop over your life, and however much you may remember what that period was like, can you reflect a bit on sort of what we should learn from that experience? Essentially, a group of boys that looked very troubled, yet ended up being real pillars of society later on.
Well, Bob, it's a great question. And we're going to have to wait for the answer because I think we lost Doug again.
Okay.
But it is true. And Bob, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are. Go ahead.
Okay. By way of background, when I was on
We lost him. Well, Bob, I'll just try to chime in a little bit here. I mean, it is interesting, that class has certainly defied expectations with 2 board chairs, several board members, the governor of Pennsylvania, very successful business and community leaders. So, but I think that's true about all adolescents. You just don't know how they're going to turn out. You give them the right, character and integrity lessons while they're here, and you launch them into society and hope they'll do the right thing.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would have anticipated it at the time.
Can you hear me?
We can, Doug,
Okay.
but not much. So given that we're having some technological problems and we're almost at the 8:30 hour, I'm going to wrap up here. I want to thank Doug Odell. I think we got the gist of Doug's comments tonight, and we appreciate. We knew there was going to be some technological challenges based on his location there, but I was really moved by his recounting of not only his time with Katrina, but his time in the Marine Corps, serving our country, and a lot of lessons to be learned there. I want to just take us ahead here for a second. There's Doug's picture again. And I'm going to clear my screen here for a second. Almost had it. Yes, it is my birthday. Yes, my parents spelled my name wrong. Coming up, we have some speakers joining us later this week. Will be Ashley Schillingsberg Aldifer, class of '02, who's the head of government relations for eBay. We're going to hear an interesting counterpoint, I think, from her in terms of her involvement with one of the major online retailers. I think everyone's very much looking forward to hearing from Bernie Chan, class of '84, who will tell us about Hong Kong's response to coronavirus and COVID-19 and how they are reopening their economy there in Hong Kong several months ahead of us. I'm really excited to announce a new speaker, Stephen Engelbaum, class of 1985, who's an urban planner out in San Francisco and has just published an article about how cities will play a role in the reopening of the economy and are playing a role even today during the pandemic. We'll then be joined by Colonel Pete Sniffen, a chaplain in the Army, longtime chaplain in the Army, now working at the U.S. Army War College here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, an alumnus and past parent. I think his daughter Amelia is on the line tonight. And then on May 19th, we'll be joined by Senator Pat Toomey, current and past parent. We'll talk about the federal response as well. We have a couple open dates there between April 23rd and May 14th. We're still looking for a few speakers. If you have any ideas, please let us know. Of course, as I've done every night, I'll just remind you of our upcoming events in the fall. We'll have our 100th anniversary celebration of the transfer of the school from the Meggs family to the Board of Trustees. We'll dedicate the Quadrivium Center, which I'm pleased to announce. We got back, construction began again today, back on track, hopefully. We'll be ready in time for the dedication in October. And then, of course, Lawrenceville weekend coming up in early November. Thanks again for joining us tonight. Hope you'll be back on Thursday for Ashley. Thanks again to Doug Odell, despite the technological challenges. Doug, are you there? Can you hear me? Still lost him. All right, well, have a great night, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy.